Good evening. My name is Mike Haynie, and welcome to another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America. Tonight, we're talking about cannabis, marijuana, weed, the legalization, medical aspect of it, and have the Honorable Martin Mitchell from the great state of Maryland with us tonight. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right. Good evening again, and welcome back to 60 Minutes in Black America. Again, my name is Mike Haynie. Thank all of you for viewing in today. If you're watching us on Facebook, please like our page. If you're watching us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as I always say, I am so grateful for the many of you from across the country that watch our show and the relevance of the information that we carry to the communities across our land. Tonight, we're going to talk about the legalization of marijuana in many states. I think at this point, we're up to 21 states and two provinces, Guam and one other province, District of Columbia. How could I forget the District of Columbia that have legalized recreational marijuana? Recreational marijuana legalization use, of course, in our community, I believe has been controversial, is that we have not shared as a community of blacks the rewards of doing so, having suffered for decades the criminalization of marijuana and the large percentage of our population that was incarcerated as a result of. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about legalized marijuana. We'll talk about the medical aspects of it. I know in the state that I'm located in, Maryland, it was just legalized for recreational use by the past legislative session that just ended this week, with a date of June, I believe, one day in June, where it will become fully legalized with the ability, I believe, to carry up to an ounce and a half without any penalty. But before we bring on the cannabis councilman, and Martin Mitchell, we'll talk more about Martin Mitchell, whose advocacy around marijuana use and as well as expungement of records of those that were criminalized for use and for possession of marijuana, particularly in our community. I want to play this tape from the citizens in Seattle, Washington, the state of Washington, because as we've always said on 60 Minutes in Black America, and why we felt it was relevant to bring this show, because so many of our communities have so many of the same issues, and comparing notes around the country so that we can figure out a path forward is paramount. But I want to show this clip, and it's a little bit longer than usual, and this will replace some of the talk that I usually do before we bring in the cannabis councilman. Let's go to this clip and let's play this clip about their issues that they had in the state of Seattle, the state of Washington, regarding the legalization of marijuana and it relates to the Black community.
Want to join me here? Won't you be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen?
1971.
America's public enemy number one is drug abuse.
The U.S. declared war. The battlefield, inner cities across the country. The targets, predominantly poor people of color.
I know that we use the war on drugs to go after Black and brown people.
When it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
Now, this is where it all started here when it came to downtown Seattle.
My store was on this side.
Entrepreneurs like Mike Haynie and Peter Manning lived through the fallout.
In the 80s, if you just simply had a joint, you would get 5 years in prison.
Decades later, the ACLU points out the lasting impact of the war on drugs, reporting that in every state with legalized marijuana, Black people are still more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. In some states, it's up to 10 times more likely.
You guys punished us for years for cannabis. It's okay, now you're doing it Now it's okay.
It's okay now because in 1998, Washington legalized medical cannabis. Mike and Peter saw it as a chance to get into the industry.
To be on the bad end when it comes to cannabis and then to convert to be on the good end was very empowering, because of growing up and just seeing the war on drugs was really the war on African Americans, the war on Black men, the war on Black women.
By 2015, Washington state legalized recreational cannabis, and everyone had to apply for new licenses. This is where minority business people felt shut out of the process, saying they felt they couldn't compete with the white-owned, well-established cannabis companies that flooded in. The result? Black people lost out. According to state data, of the state's 558 recreational pot licenses, only 19, or 4%, went to Black applicants.
And there is zero African American ownership in the city of Seattle. To be supposedly in this progressive state, it's not showing.
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and we'll just get started.
The BIPOC community immediately fought back, demanding answers and action from the Liquor and Cannabis Board, or LCB, during public meetings.
We feel disrespected. We're not listened to.
Between 2016 and 2019, the state commissioned 2 independent reports to audit LCB's enforcement program and investigate allegations of discrimination from licensees. They had been accused of handing over $1 billion industry to white licensees, failing to provide educational resources for applicants, and giving out inconsistent interpretations of the law that left some candidates like Peter with rejected applications. Do you see why people of color feel like they just can't catch a break?
Yes. I mean, even with this, what's the saying, a day late, dollar short?
Ollie Garrett is an LCB board member. She's also on the state's newly formed Social Equity and Cannabis Task Force. So there are still no Black-owned dispensaries in the city of Seattle. And this is after 2 years of this task force in place. Do you call that a failure?
Yes. I would call that a failure, a missed opportunity. Could it have been done different in the beginning? Yes, but this was a new industry. Who knew? Who thought about inclusion and Blacks being left out?
The people that were left out, they have a huge disadvantage now because they're missing 6 years in the industry. How do you fix that?
We can't go backwards. We just have to go forward.
So far, the plan to go forward is stumbling. The task force recommended setting aside 38 marijuana business licenses specifically for people of color. But state records show more than half of those licenses are in areas where pot sales are currently banned, essentially making them useless.
So what are you giving me? A license that says that I have the right to sell cannabis, but I can't sell cannabis because I can't open up in this location because it's banned? How's that equity?
Do you understand why some of the people in this realm feel like these are leftovers? They're being given scraps that they can't use.
Right now, the LCB cannot move license out of the areas that they're in or create new license without legislation.
Garrett says the LCB will request that legislation in the upcoming session.
So it'll mean a tremendous amount to me, my family, get back to what we lost. We lost out on generational wealth.
Until that happens, these men want the public to be more conscious about where the money they spend on cannabis really ends up.
There's white-owned stores in our Black neighborhoods. 10 years ago, you were locking us up for the same thing. White people are making millions of dollars. They're taking that money out of our community and they're putting it in the white community. We want our Black-owned stores in our communities. Seattle, our communities. Period.
Wow, powerful clip, powerful clip. And let's bring the Honorable Martin Mitchell, the cannabis councilman, self-described, of Laurel, Maryland. Honorable Mitchell, how are you doing today?
What's going on? Hey, I wasn't even say self-described. That was the name that Donnie gave me. So that's
and you're okay with that, right?
Yes, because, it's for many reasons. One, Donnie gave it to me because of how proudly I talk about cannabis and, advocate being a medical patient and responsible adult use, restorative justice, all of that. But one thing to remind people, and I'm sure just following me and, being a friend, is that cannabis is just one of the issues. if I'm talking about workers' rights, if I'm talking about tenant rights, if I'm talking about a better government, a lot of times I will just relate that back to cannabis, or, it'll just be one of the big things that I discuss. So cannabis isn't all I do, but the cannabis councilman, some people know me just by that, right? Like,
Well, I think the good thing for us to know you about that today is that that's an impetus of racism and the injustice economically in our country. If we look at one sole business that will be worth what they say $100 billion by the year 2030, legalize marijuana, legalize recreational marijuana, the medical aspects and use of marijuana, and the fact that blacks essentially have been shut out of that game. So were you elected? Let's talk about you for a minute. You're from the city of Laurel, Maryland. At 32, you're 32 years old, and to me, what makes me proud of someone like you represent our young people and represent issues and aren't afraid, very outspoken, very well spoken to what's happening today. So you're the generation that we're relying on in this country to begin to push issues through. But let's talk about you, man, family structure. I know you got a couple of sons. You live in the great city of Laurel in the great state of Maryland. So talk about yourself for a minute and why you decided to run for political office.
Sure. I'm a Laurel native. I moved from Long Island, New York, in first grade. And so, Laurel is my home. I have twin sons, Julian and Jaden. They're in first grade. And I would say the very first reason I got into politics was, I went to a HBCU. I went to Bowie State, one of the greatest in the state of Maryland, definitely one of the first. So I went to Bowie State, and I loved all of my civics. I loved all of my political science classes. And one of the things is I realized that, I didn't need an entrepreneurship degree to become an entrepreneur. And I realized that, like, I really enjoyed, my political science electives and classes, and it just came a lot more naturally to me. So I switched over to political science major. From initially when I entered college, international business entrepreneurship major. And, one of the things that I realized was I was taking a philosophy class in Bowie, and I realized long ago, even in high school, when I was taking like AP government and honors government, that, politics and civic government can be corrupt. And, I remember I asked my question, like, if politics are corrupt, like, why would you get involved? Why would you run? Especially as an honest person, someone who's going to be an honest character. And, what he said to me then kind of changed the course of my life. He said, if you have the capacity to lead and you don't lead, don't be upset when you're led by a lesser person. And like, I sat with it for a few days. But long story short, shortly after, I got involved with the Democratic Young Dems in Prince George's County. And, no longer was sitting on the sidelines. I was like, well, I don't like that. The organization is more so just social, that they're not doing community engagement. And so, like, that's when I got involved. I ran for central committee person for the Young Dems. And then our whole board basically like resigned, I think almost like a few months in. And so it's just me and the president. And, from there, she was like, do you want to be VP? And I was like, sure, I'll be VP. But even then, I didn't want to like be in the front. I didn't want to take the spotlight. Like, so I know, like, for me, I was like, no, I like playing the background. I like organizing and orchestrating things, but not necessarily cameras asking me questions. And so, like, little by little, she started giving me more to do and, asking me to step up more. And then I ran for president. And, about a year or two later, I ran for a local office in my hometown of Laurel. A lot of people said, hey, you could be a delegate with your experience. You can, do other things, why run in your city? But I always believed that local government was the most important because local government hits closest to home. A lot of people, didn't even know what their councilman at large did. And so, I think that the biggest thing that I've done since being in office is giving people a voice that didn't have a voice. They say the voice for the voiceless, but also helping other people's ideas come to fruition. Like, you see me do all these community events. A lot of times it's never about me doing the community event, but it's about working with the community to put on this event. And so, like, a lot of times the constituents and the business are coming to me with these ideas, and I'm just helping facilitate it. And
Wow.
so, you know, that's of course, you know, a little bit of who I am. But yeah.
Well, it's something about you in terms of the persona that you have that to me is in correlation to the two young men down in Tennessee that, you know, spoke loud voice, young as you were. What do you think about what happened with them in their advocacy, outspokenness on the state senate or state legislative floor of Tennessee? And do you kind of see that that's how you are too, an outspoken voice of honesty and truth for the people?
Well, you know, I think that what happened, I'm glad that it happened, right? I'm glad that it happened because it put America really on display, not just America, but Tennessee. Like, how are we going to deal with, you know, of course, all these terrible mass shootings going on? But, you know, I think the bigger thing is like silencing democracy. Like, I've actually had, as an elected official, had my microphone cut off, right? And, you know, that in itself, you know, is disrespectful because you were there, you were sent there to represent the constituents. And if you have leadership or you have someone who's controlling your microphone and not letting you, you know, voice your opinion, because at the end of the day, like, we can agree to disagree, but not be disagreeable, right?
Wow.
And so I think that I'm glad that they really got to see it on display. And those two individuals, they're going to get more fundraising. They're going to get more volunteers. You know, they just got a national platform, and they're gonna ignite a whole new voter base. You saw how many young folks were there. Some of those folks, you know, are not voting age, right? But some of them will be, you know, come next election.
Well, let's talk about the fact that you all, because I put you into that basket as well, because what they did in raising their profile, I believe they raised your profile as well, particularly with some of the things that are happening in your state, particularly with your advocacy of cannabis, right? So was that a driving force in you being elected, the fact that you were very transparent and open in your desire to make cannabis or marijuana or weed something that was legalized, open, and how did that start relative to your candidacy, the marijuana initiative?
Sure. I think you know, as you go up, more people learn about you, right, and who you are. So, you know, anybody who's known me for more than 5 years knows that, like, you know, I'm one of the leading cannabis advocates, not only in Maryland, you know, but across the, you know, the United States. You know, so I started advocating, at least publicly, for cannabis as a young Dem. I remember, I think it was like 2020 or 2019, we were putting on virtual town halls, you know, well before there were legalization bills, well before the referendum came. And we were working with some of the medical dispensaries. Like, I remember Marion, Maine Medical Dispensary, run by Hope Wiseman, one of the youngest dispensary owners, not only in Maryland, but in the nation. And so, like, you know, I had been advocating long before deciding to run. And so when I ran, I was very intentional about, you know, telling the public, you know, hey, I'm a medical cannabis patient. I do believe in legalization. I do believe in responsible adult use. And, you know, here are the reasons why. But not only that, I think the bigger thing I did was try to make medicinal cannabis, you know, more widely known and you know, looked at differently as a holistic alternative. And so, like, I partner with these dispensaries to do food drives, to do toy drives, to do expungement clinics, as you were talking about, right? To do know your rights clinics. So, you know, they actually knew their rights as, you know, these laws were working their ways through the chambers over the certain years. And so, like, I think it was important to kind of show the community that, like, one, cannabis can be medicine. And, you know, even when it's not medicine, you know, there can be responsible therapeutic adult use, right? And
Wow.
and I think that the biggest thing is you still don't see a lot of elected officials sponsoring or partnering with medical dispensaries, right? Like, I'm pretty sure I'm one of the only ones in the state that, like, actively sponsors with medical cannabis dispensaries, because they need good PR too, right? They need to not just make money and go home.
Right. And, you know, you're watching 60 Minutes in Black America. We have the cannabis councilman, the Honorable Martin Mitchell from the city of Laurel, Maryland, who is an advocate for, as he just mentioned to you, responsible use of marijuana or cannabis. Post your questions in the chat. I see a couple of questions in the chat now for the councilman or for myself regarding this subject. And let's bring the councilman back on. Let's talk about cannabis, particularly in your state, in terms of the recent legislation that was passed, as it was passed in 21 states in this country, and two provinces, Guam and the District of Columbia, where it's legalized recreational, and what your thoughts are behind that legalization in your state and what it means for Black communities.
Sure. I mean, I think that the first thing we should mention is in the state of Maryland, when it came to the medical market, we didn't do right by, the Black community, especially in terms of like ownership, right? I know that there's a state study that was done, and, it came back that, there was no, there was no inequity, but a lot of people who were consumers, a lot of people who were business owners, a lot of people who tried to apply, they can tell you very differently. And, I can tell you there's about 101 operating dispensaries in the state of Maryland. Only a handful of those are actually minority owned. You have, a few more which are woman owned. But, a lot of them are Caucasian owned, dispensaries. And the same thing goes when you go to the cultivations, so there's about, I think it's about like 13, 14 operating cultivators. And I would say there's about, I think it's about one, maybe 1.5 minority cultivators. And then even less when you go in the processors.
Wow.
So, I would say that I'm hopeful for this recreational market, because one of the things is they set up a capital access program, and they put the social equity department under the governor's office. So the governor will make a lot of decisions and have a lot of power, especially over social equity, which I'm hopeful, because the governor should understand that people like him and I should, have access to this industry in which we were criminalized for so long. And the thought is, I was a little upset that some of the criminal justice provisions were like removed from this bill. The way that they dealt with the bill this year is they dealt with the framework, and then they passed bills in relation to, expungements. They worked on bills in relation to probable cause. But, I believe that should have been the same package, because I believe that we lost a lot of bargaining power when we're talking about, the financial aspect, but we're not talking about righting the wrongs, decarcerating people who were prisoners for nonviolent cannabis charges. And then also, the expungements of people who have already served their time. Because one of the things I found out during the clinics is like, there were some people who have charges from, 20, 30 years ago that still didn't get it expunged.
Well, it's interesting you say that. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat relative to the legalization of marijuana and whether it should have been legalized in Maryland, as well as the other 21 states. There are states that have hybrid models of, yes, it's good medical, but no, it's not good recreational. We know that Colorado and Washington State were the first to legalize it from a recreational or total legalization standpoint back in 2012, 2015. We know North Carolina. Do not drive in North Carolina. Do not drive in South Carolina and expect that marijuana is legal there. Either way, whether it's medical or recreational. But you have two sons, you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
And to the question that to the comments I'm reading in the chat now from people that say that they don't believe in legalized marijuana, do you feel that it would be okay for your sons to use marijuana in the 9th or 10th grade? Would you be okay with that?
No, of course. I mean, I think that the biggest thing we said is responsible adult use, right?
So responsible adult use.
I'm not okay with my kid drinking in 9th or 10th grade, smoking cigars, So at the end of the day, it's as some people might look at it, another vice, but I just have to open the people's minds up to, it is medicine, right? And there are millions of Americans that use it for medicine and medicinal purposes. So even if we're talking about the recreational therapeutic use, when you get off work, if you're at your happy hour, the medicinal part is mainly the larger part that I was pushing. And
I got you.
Have been pushing, right? And because as we look at this medicine, we do more research on the plant.
So as you talk about the fact that you were looking at it from the medicinal use aspect of it, but now it's open recreational, and you as a public figure that people have put their trust in to ensure that the process is fair. So it is out there now, and as you say, in Maryland, you have a black governor, and you hope that the social equity piece, because I know Louisiana tried the same thing in terms of those that were to get licenses, were those that were incarcerated for 5 years or more as a result of marijuana criminalization laws back then. New York State has done the same thing, but what happened was an access to capital issue. But before we get into the social aspect of why Black communities should benefit from marijuana legislation, let's talk about marijuana as a drug. Let's say that, knowing that you are a medical cannabis advocate, but when we've now legalized it in many states in our community, is marijuana a gateway drug, something that leads from marijuana to crack cocaine to serious alcohol abuse to fentanyl when we allow it to be used in our community? Was this a good move for it to be legalized in Maryland?
So I think I'll say a few things, right? So the first thing I'll lead with is one of the cannabis bills I was working on this year was for Connor Sheffield. If anybody is familiar, Connor Sheffield, he's a pediatric medical patient, and he got laws changed in the state of Maryland a few years ago called Connor and Rayner's Law. And basically that allowed pediatric medical patients to, take their medicine, with the school nurse on school grounds, because previously the way that this medical pediatric patient had to, go about it was his mom had to come to school every day, take him off the school grounds, give him, his medication, and then bring him back to the school grounds. So for a parent or a guardian, this of course was disruptive. And we've already recognized that, it is, a legal medical substance, because this is of course years ago before recreational. And, so that law changed the quality of his life, because Connor, like several other people who are medical patients, they use this to improve their quality of life. Connor had dozens of surgeries before he was even in I think 11th grade. And so cannabis oil, CBD was the only thing that really helped Connor. And Connor now is a college student at community college, advocating on another bill. The bill that he's advocating for now is a bill that passed in California, which allows medical cannabis patients access to their medicine while in hospice care or in hospitals. So not non-smokables, of course, and you have to be able to take it on your own fruition. So not the doctor giving it to you. And the thing I also remind people is cannabis can be consumed in many different ways. Like cannabis isn't just, a plant that you're lighting up. Cannabis could be oils. Cannabis can be tinctures. Cannabis can be, go in your teas. And I think that the second point I wanted to make was when we talk about the gateway drug, right? I didn't even finish the counterpoint. The biggest thing I wanted to say about the counterpoint, the reason I pushed was because states where we see medical cannabis, we see at least a 30% or more decrease in fentanyl and opioid usage. And as we've all complained, there's an opioid crisis. We are all aware that there's an opioid crisis, right? And so that's something to look into. I would say that the bigger point, I saw a comment about, responsible adult use. Sure. I'm going to be honest with you. Will some teenagers use cannabis? Yes. Have some teenagers used cannabis in the past? Absolutely, yes. I'm not going to be ignorant to say that. But here's what I will say. I will say that in states where they have recreational use, there is not reported statistics of teen usage going up or more children using cannabis.
Councilman, let's be real, right? So we looked at that video at the top of the hour, right, that showed Black young men mainly being arrested. You and I know that on the street corners, maybe a decade ago, Black young men selling nickel bags, OZs or whatever, because that was part of the economy in the Black community, that we had in our community of young teenagers selling bags of weed, rocks of crack cocaine. So to say that they weren't using, and we know that was a thriving industry before all of a sudden it seems to have been systemically shut down so that it's forced in a legalized environment with formal storefronts that have taken out. Same thing they did when we desegregated communities back in the 50s. We desegregated communities, and all of a sudden we were able to go buy in white communities, and it decimated Black businesses. So we're looking at this from purely a business aspect. But we know that our young people were heavily engaged and are heavily engaged in the use of marijuana. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would say there is no disparity in difference of use among Black teenagers or white teenagers. So I know I wouldn't agree with that premise. And
that in our communities, in our poor Black communities, mainly, that marijuana wasn't an economic vehicle for many to sustain themselves by selling marijuana on the street corners. I mean, I remember,
I don't think that was your initial question. I don't think you asked me if selling drugs on the streets was a sustainable business. I thought your question was something else.
That was what I implied. You're right. Maybe I didn't say that, but we know that young people, and the point was two. Number one, it was an economic vehicle in our communities. Number two, that our teenage boys, your son's age, my son's age, and I've had sons in my household, the age of your sons out there, exposed to and possibly using marijuana. It's a huge issue in Black communities with our young people, particularly our young men.
Well, I would say it's a bigger issue because of the criminality behind the cannabis usage as a Black person.
It's a bigger issue because of the criminality behind it.
The criminality. As I was stating the facts, right? The facts are that Blacks and whites use cannabis at about the same rate. The facts are that they even if they get arrested at the same rate, they're not getting convicted at the same rate. So I'm just speaking to the facts. I'm just speaking to the point.
So isn't it the fact that the arrest rate and conviction rate are well different for whites than it is for Black? The arrest rate for whites is far less than it is for Blacks. That's a fact, right?
Yes, but I wouldn't say it was near as much a disparity when it came to the conviction rate. They're a lot closer on the arrest rate, especially if we're talking 5 years, 10 years back.
Well, when you look at it in comparison to totality, and you're talking about states, are we frozen? Are we still here? Did we lose the councilman?
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So when we talk about Wyoming and we talk about Vermont, yeah, when you look at the totality of it, but Councilman, when you look at cities like Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore, Detroit, that are mainly Black, it's hard to look at the comparison of arrest rates. We know that in Baltimore, for instance, back in the 90s, under a mayor that had a no tolerance or zero tolerance law, that most of the arrests for petty crimes such as possession and use of marijuana were such that it took them out of a game further than just dealing drugs. So all of a sudden, as you said, you also advocate for expungement. Many of them decades later couldn't even get, jobs or can't get jobs.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems like I didn't see the question in that one, but I do agree with some of that sentiment. I mean,
yeah, but so the question is that it is detrimental. Legalization of marijuana, as some of the viewers have said, that is detrimental to our communities. The legalization of marijuana appears to be a setup so that the system can all of a sudden legalize it, take us out of the economic game, which they've done. You said that yourself. They've taken us out of the economic game, right? In the medical aspect of it, looks like it's happening in the recreational aspect of it. Washington State being the case, Louisiana being the case, New York State being the case, and then selling us marijuana in our community and taking that economic boom out of our community by selling it to us. And that's the reason why it appears as though to many, they've decriminalized marijuana, so that all of a sudden they realize the money in it and the value of it of saying, hey, if they're going to use it anyway, let's legalize it and sell it to them and not let them in the game of being able to be beneficiaries of this economy. Would you agree to that? Do you see that that is how some people view it?
So I can understand, the picture frame, and yes, as I said, there are some people who have been left out, but I think since we've taken so long as a state to actually legalize, we can learn from some of the wrongs of other states, right? Like New Jersey, I'm not going to say that they're the best model, but they've done a good job in giving people who were disproportionately and previously impacted an opportunity to get provisional licenses, an opportunity to get access to funding, micro licenses, and so like I'm hoping in Maryland that some of that actually happens, especially under the fact that the biggest thing that I'd say one of the biggest successes is we no longer have it under, it was going to be under alcohol, tobacco commission. So now it's going to be its own cannabis commission under the state government that deals with cannabis and hemp. And so the reason I say that is because you will see influences from big tobacco and big cannabis. Big tobacco and big liquor on cannabis, right? Like, and the reason I say that is because when you see that, then you try to see more Walmarts of cannabis, and then actually like craft boutiques, or actually people who care and have intrinsic knowledge about the plant, right? Like you see people who are just necessarily going to try to make a dollar instead of giving you the best possible things or best possible products.
Well, the interesting thing, Councilman, is that we spent years fighting the use of cigarettes and smoking, right? And I believe that recreational use of cannabis, the main way to do it is still smoking a joint, right? Or a blunt, whatever they call it, right?
Not necessarily. That's
not necessarily, but the recreational use of marijuana in our communities, they're not dropping gummies in our community. And now if you look at it in the wider picture, and I haven't quantified this,
sure,
right? But I know that if you're growing a plant, you're not just extracting THC. And can you explain to us what THC is before we get into the extraction of THC and being able to grow marijuana plants in your home and legalized state for your own use? What is THC? What's the value of THC, and what is that?
Sure. So hydra cannabinoid. THC is one of the components of the cannabis plant, and THC is of course the effect that gives you the euphoria. It's the component that gives you the euphoria of the cannabis.
Is that the component that solves your pain too, from the medical aspect use of it?
Oh, well, sure, but it's not just THC. I think that the biggest part about me becoming a medical patient several years ago was the education. And so I think even with the recreational market upcoming, I think there still needs to be an educational component for the consumers. So they're not just THC chasers. Because when I first came in, I wanted whatever's going to get me, the highest, right? That's what I wanted, because I'm coming from a recreational market to a medical market. So that's what I thought. But then I learned that terpenes, I learned that there is, pinene, there's limonene, and these different terpenes, you will get a certain effect from it. And so like, I know that like, okay, pinene, that makes me anxious. I'm not going to do pinene. I know limonene is very great for focusing. I know, okay, myrcene is in the evening time when you're trying to go to sleep. So,
so Councilman, if I can interject, so is this the genetic, the genetic manipulation of THC so that it zones in and makes those different effects for you? Because, like you said, you were looking for the euphoric,
everything has
the pain, right? So the euphoric and get you as high as possible. Was that the medical aspect to make you forget about the pain? Is that what?
To be honest with you, the better way to explain it is there's terpenes in almost everything. Like mango has myrcene, right? And so like pine trees have pinene, right? And so like I think that's the best way to explain it. these certain terpenes, you can smell them. So limonene is usually going to smell lemony, but then it will also give your body a certain effect. And so like the THC can do many things. High THC and like lower CBD gives you more of a balanced plant and gives you more of a a balanced experience. And so that's what they call sometimes one-to-ones. And so like CBD mainly comes from the cousin plant to the cannabis plant, which is the hemp plant. And I think one of the bigger things in a rural agricultural state like Maryland, we're really not and hadn't capitalized on the hemp market. And in 2017, they legalized, hemp sale with the Farm Bill, right? And so like the state of Maryland, I could tell you where I am, just in Prince George's County, we have Upper Marlboro, we have Bowie. There's a lot of land in Laurel. There's a lot of places that could grow and develop hemp. So we're not talking about the cannabis plant that has all this euphoria, but the CBD plant, which has a lot of medicinal properties, but even more so industrial uses.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. This has gone way beyond and so complicated to when I was coming up, a few years before you, and reefer, weed, marijuana, Jane was smokable. And still, when you look at it, you can package it. And this is an I statement. You can package it any way you want. When you look at the effects of it on the Black community. So there's two things we're talking about: the effect that it has on the Black community from a legalization standpoint. And now that we've done that, the unfairness relative.
That all started from the propaganda. That all started from the propaganda when marijuana was first prohibited.
Propaganda. When you say propaganda, what propaganda in terms of its use?
So the propaganda of the reefer madness and how terrible the plant was, but a lot of that had to do with hemp, and hemp was going to take over the paper industry. And
well, I think a lot of it precipitated from the fact that people saw that marijuana users became crack cocaine users and crack or cocaine users, and it expedited the use. This is how
initially. No, you might be talking about something in the 60s that's correlated in the 60s, 70s, or 80s.
When you look at where we are today, you're right, because as I mentioned, you are part of that generation that is educating us as to the factors, because you're knowledgeable about this. But when we look at the effect that it had after the Vietnam War, for instance, when many of our soldiers came back addicted to heroin, smoking weed, etc., and the effect of the 1994 Violence Reduction Act that the federal government put out there, and they targeted weed or marijuana smokers, and what it did to our community, the very fiber where you couldn't go more than a block without seeing a group of our young people in inner cities dealing and selling marijuana. And is this something that will intentionally destroy the fiber of our communities by legalizing it? And are we ready for that as a community? Are we ready for the effect of legalized marijuana? We know that we haven't done a very good job legislatively of ensuring that there was a equity piece tied to the sell aspect of it. But when it comes to our communities being able to absorb now a legalized drug environment, is it going to do more harm than it was intended to do? And you feel as though it's not.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And I will say that, I know several people that, had alcohol abuse, right? And, they converted to cannabis or CBD. Which is, of course, we said doesn't have the euphoric effect. And, I would say that our communities, we should make them ready, right? Like the thing is responsible adult use. I don't think in any way you're going to promote cannabis to children. And that's why we have to be careful when it comes to the advertising and packaging, right? Like, because as we know, we've seen it with tobacco, how they can target children. And so I am definitely going to be taking seriously the enforcement aspect. Like, this shouldn't be, sold at gas stations, shouldn't be sold, in places like that.
It was sold at gas stations, Councilman. It's been sold at gas stations and in front of liquor stores and in front of stores in our community. And you're right, now that it shouldn't be, hear me out for a second. So now that it shouldn't be, and the kids that may have benefited economically by selling it at gas stations and at liquor stores and outside of churches now have been taken out of the game. It wasn't as though they said in, let's say, Edmondson Village or Laurel Shopping Center that we're going to set up a cannabis store and allow these young people that were selling it outside of Laurel Mall, that were 16, 17-year-old black boys, let them run it legally as a counter drug. It's not happening. So you're saying that you're going to work to legislate it so that it cannot be so. But for decades, that's where it was sold. It's sold in the streets. It's a street drug.
Yeah. Well,
we've been taken out of the game economically, and we get nothing out of it, right?
No. I mean, clearly, I wasn't necessarily talking about the street corner, because I'm not down in the street pharmacist. I'll be honest with you. I'm definitely not knocking on the street pharmacist. I was talking about the legal business owners that are selling, cannabis or CBD that's not tested, because I know that one of the biggest things that you probably heard is the fact that the CBD market is very upset at the new legalization bill, because the new legalization bill, basically restricts the sale of Delta 8. And, as you know, Delta 8 isn't necessarily part of the natural plant. It's extracted, right? And put back in. And so the problem being with Delta 8 is a lot of times they don't get a third party tested, especially if they're not at reputable consumers or not reputable shops.
Well, I got to tell you, Councilman, when I look at the governor of the state of Maryland and I look at other legislative advocates of this marijuana bill, because there's been a lot of corruption in it throughout the country, not just in the state of Maryland, but throughout. And our representatives, our political representatives that have been behind this, because in many jurisdictions, if you talk about New York State, you mentioned New Jersey. I think you had someone from Pennsylvania on your show today that represented the industry. I think you did. But when you look at these states with significant black legislatures and legislative representatives that realize the harm it did when it was criminalized, and it still is criminalized to a large degree in many states, and we're still the recipient of the highest criminalization issues tied to it, even though it's been unquote unquote decriminalized, right? How could you pass this legislation, be in front of this legislation, governors sign this legislation, knowing that 2% of this $32 billion today, $32 billion estimated to be $100 billion by 2030, only 2% of black businesses or blacks are participatory in this. Is that responsible legislation? When we were over 50% of the criminal aspect of this?
I would say that I have many different comments about the final product of the bill. I don't think that 2%, I think as you said, is a fair number. But I do know that they are going to have a social equity program.
You mean like Washington State?
I believe it'll be a little bit better than Washington State, because I think that from Washington State, if I recall, they require, I think it's 55% minority ownership, I believe, or 50. I believe we're requiring 65%.
Well, the bigger thing, Councilman, and this is a great discussion, man. I couldn't have figured out a better person to have on the show than you, that most of the funding, because we know you can't get a small business administration loan for this, because what? It's not approved at the federal level, right? So that it's generational wealth that funds this, capital venture funds that fund this, right?
Capital access program.
That's right. Typically, which funds businesses for the cannabis and legalized marijuana business, are capital ventures or families with money, the same that we believe that bring the drugs from overseas into our communities, right? And permeate them with drugs, the same money. And we don't typically have access to that. But what I'm saying is that outside of you that's very transparent about this, you have legislative blacks that have advocated for the legalization of this, not necessarily doing the study to realize the implications of our young people that were already decimated by high poverty, low graduation rate educationally, and now all of a sudden you're going to tell them it's okay to smoke pot.
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna say I hear that premise.
So my question to you, because you're very astute, and you said, well, what's your question, Mike? So my question is legalization of marijuana, when on the federal level, the federal government doesn't see it this way. I mean, Joe Biden freed 6,500 or expunged 6,500 mainly black people from the 90s. He expunged them. They weren't in jail anymore. Chuck Schumer is introducing laws at the federal level so that it doesn't become criminal and that they don't engage states that have made it legal, right? But how can black legislature look at this and see this as something that's beneficial to the black community? Tell me how. And then we're not even getting an economic benefit out of it.
I would say that we are still going to remain hopeful that, we're going to get some economic benefit, especially we want to be involved in the business, right? We want to make sure that we're allowed to get regular licenses, micro licenses. We can get everything from the dispensary to the ancillary businesses, right? And a lot of times, as I tell, a lot of young blacks or a lot of people of color who want to get in the market, it's not just the cultivation. There's several avenues in which you can flourish in this immature market. I think that the sales tax was one of the big things that a lot of people talked about, right? But I think that
talk about that. So for the states to realize that now that they've brought and the perception is, and maybe it was a stigma, that most of the drug sales were going on in the inner city communities. Whites coming in to buy their fentanyl, their marijuana, etc. We know that they were taking garbage bags out in the suburban areas anyway. But now all of a sudden they say, well, hey, we can't stop this. We might as well get a share of the money, right? So talk about the sales tax aspect of that in the state, like a state of Maryland. Is the state of Maryland going to realize that? What are they going to do with that money? Have they said?
So, I mean, it's a 9% sales tax. There's a community reinvestment fund. So some of that will go into the community reinvestment fund. Some of that would go back to counties. And then those counties would distribute it to their cities and municipalities. I believe that there's going to be some guidelines on how that money can be spent on which programs.
Right.
And a lot of local jurisdictions are going to have a lot of control over how that money gets spent once it makes it to their municipality. I think that when you look at one of the first legal states I visited was Colorado. In Colorado, they had more dispensaries than there were Starbucks, especially if you're including the recreational and the medical. And one of the greatest things I saw was just a lot of the public infrastructure that had developed in the last 10 or 15 years because of the money that had come in from cannabis.
Now you as a black man that went to a HBCU, looking at Colorado potentially as an example compared to a state like Maryland, which may have, I'm not sure what the percentage or rate is of African Americans did you see that reinvestment go into communities as a social justice change agent, or was it just that the highways that they built out there and some of the other infrastructure, which I know they've done out of Colorado as a result of that, benefited everyone? I mean, where do we see in our communities the benefit of a 9% tax on potentially a $2-3 billion industry? Is it earmarked for the poor sections of Laurel where you're at, for instance?
Well, as I said, they're going to be distributing it back to the counties, and us as a municipality, we'll have certain guidelines, but we can really decide on what programs we use. Like I would love to have a program that filters more access by hiring a Latino affairs person, so we can actually connect more as a government with the Latino population that's growing in our city.
How about drug intervention programs such as they did with the lottery program when they started casinos and lotteries? They put in drug intervention. They put in Gamblers Anonymous and psychiatrists. If you gamble,
have that.
Have they put that in place for use of drugs?
They do. They're putting a good amount of money towards drug reduction, education, a lot of as you said, drug abuse. So there's definitely plans for that, and they're setting up that. So that's definitely been a lot of the conversation. I don't know how much money exactly is going to it. I believe it was somewhere in the single-digit percentage, but
well, I hope that they put enough in it, because I have a feeling they're going to need it, particularly for our communities. And one final question before we turn back to you, because we want to know about you and what your future plans are. 32 years old, and what I call a superstar politician with integrity in our state. One more question. So, and this is hypothetical, right? So you have 4 or 5 black young men, 18 years old, got 2 bags of weed, decide to set up a lemonade type weed stand on the corner of Route 1 and Cherry Hill Road, for instance, right? Now, what do you do in that scenario? So all of a sudden it's legalized to what it is our black young people were doing a few years ago, able to sell it, running away from the police catching them, locking them up, putting them in jail. Now they have a record. Now the state has legalized it, and these young people get caught selling it. What are the implications there? What should the implications be? Should they be able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. I definitely still believe in the black market. So that's just me being complete upfront with you. I definitely still believe in the black market. I would say that in that aspect, they'll probably be looking at something like gifting, right? It'd probably be something similar to DC. So, I wouldn't believe that they would get in trouble, but I will say that me as a public servant, one of the things I would do is try to help them actually legitimize their business, right? And actually, go through the steps to, obtain a delivery license or, a micro business. And I think one of the biggest things that I was pushing for, since we will have home growth, we could have 4 plants as a medical patient, and I believe it's 2 plants as an everyday person. One of the things I was pushing for was cottage businesses and cottage business licenses. So basically, allowing people to grow at their home, allowing them to sell, allowing them to test their products, get their products tested, and then sell their products. Sell the products at dispensaries, sell the products at farmers markets. Wherever you have you, but basically they don't need to obtain a micro license where you actually have to, have infrastructure, even if it was a smaller space, but, they can do it out of their home. And there's several successful cottage businesses that have been run across America for years. So,
well, Honorable Mitchell, I really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate you being here today. And final question for you, man, where do you go from here? Where do you go? Do we see you at the state level as a state delegate? Do we see you as a state senator? You run for representative of the U.S. House? Because at 32 years old, the comparison is those 2 young men in Tennessee. We think we've got someone in Maryland similar in quality as you are. Where do you go from here with your advocacy?
Well, I'm going to continue to advocate for Prince George's County first. And, I'll definitely, uplift Laurel. We have an election in November. Our mayor's not running. We've had the same mayor for 22 years.
Wow.
So maybe it's the first and youngest black mayor of Laurel.
So are you saying here on 60 Minutes in Black America, we could have a candidate for mayor of the city of Laurel? And for those of you who don't know Laurel and have not heard of Laurel throughout the country, in 1972, Laurel is where presidential candidate and former governor of the state of Alabama, George Wallace, was shot and paralyzed. and he was almost on the same parallel as Donald Trump is in terms of his popularity. But that's a different conversation. But Laurel is a very well-known community and commodity for the state of Maryland. But so we could see you as a mayoral candidate, is what you're saying.
You very well could. I just, just thinking about what's next and, what I can do for the city. So.
Hey, well, listen, we're behind you, man. And if you make that announcement, man, we want to know first. And again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Councilman Mitchell, for being on 60 Minutes in Black America. Thank you so much for informing us and giving us information on medical as well as the recreational marijuana market. And again, you're watching 60 Minutes in Black America. My name is Mike Haynie. It's been a great show. The cannabis councilman, the Honorable Martin Mitchell, educated us in his advocacy, not just of marijuana in terms of the recreational use of it, but the medical aspect of it. And many questions in the chat. Did we turn our home gardens now into weed gardens? Many people believe that the legalization of marijuana in Black communities is the beginning of the deterioration of our infrastructure of young people. And I gotta say that I'm not certain that this is the direction that we want to go in as a community. We know why businesses sees the value of decriminalization and legalization of marijuana, because if they saw the value of it to the betterment of all communities, particularly Black communities, it would not be so difficult for us to get in the game. But I will tell you that Maryland will be one of those states that we need to watch closely in terms of how they handle the social aspect of economic benefit for people that were taken advantage of during the criminal aspect of it, now that they have decriminalized and legalized marijuana. How they've handled the medical aspect of it is not very encouraging. Another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America. My name is Mike Haynie. Thank you so much for joining us. Please have a great week and look forward to seeing you next week, this time on 60 Minutes in Black America.